So the tough question from Jesus for this week is actually I think it's kind of a funny one, because it shows us Jesus at his most human. In the midst of what was a really frustrating situation for him, Jesus said, and you can see it, it's kind of small letters up here, but it says, "How much longer must I put up with you?" That's the question. That's what you call a rhetorical question. It means he wasn't expecting an answer. He was just expressing his frustration. He was expressing his exasperation with his disciples. It's like the mom who threatens to knock her kids into next week. Have you ever done that? My grandpa used to threaten he was going to box my ears. Sometimes he said he was going to knock my head clean off. I was. Of course, he didn't really mean it, but I usually had it coming. He never acted on it, but he said it. And so did the disciples. They had it coming that day, and we're going to read that story in just a minute. After nearly 3 years with Jesus, they still didn't understand what it meant for him to be the Messiah. He had told them, actually several times at this point, that what it meant for him to be the Messiah was that he needed to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die and be raised again on the third day. But they didn't get it. They were still dreaming of ruling alongside him in honor and glory. That's where they thought things were headed. The context of our scripture reading today is Mount Tabor, actually the base of Mount Tabor in southern Galilee. Here's a picture of it. I was there in 2020. And it looks just like that. There's this big, flat kind of plain, and there's this giant hill. I know it's kind of hard to call it a mountain, but it's big. Up on the top of that, there's a road that goes up to the top of it. There's a church that's built on the top of it. It's also called the Mount of Transfiguration because it was there that Jesus was transfigured. He was transformed before the eyes of his disciples, Peter, James, and John. It's where they saw him walking with Elijah and with Moses. So that represents the law, the prophets, and now the gospel, right? And Jesus is there. It's this amazing moment when God says to Peter, James, and John, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." So those disciples had the very definition of a mountaintop experience. And not surprisingly, they wanted to stay there. I mean, who wouldn't? Peter was ready to build some tiny houses right there on top of Mount Tabor and just move in. So you can imagine that Jesus might have been a little frustrated with those three already. Because if you think about it, there's no way for Jesus to fulfill his mission in Jerusalem if they stay up there on top of Mount Tabor, right? It's not going to happen. So if you think that's bad, it gets worse. As Jesus and those three come down the mountain, they soon discover what the other 9 were up to. So what he discovers is that not only had those 9 failed in their attempt to heal a demon-possessed boy, but now they were in the middle of an argument with some scribes, with some religious leaders. In other words, they were drawing a crowd. And they were drawing a crowd for all the wrong reasons. No one was being healed. No one was being encouraged. No one was being taught. It was just a mess. And so we're going to read that story now in Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 24. When they came to the disciples, the base of Mount Tabor, they saw a great crowd around them and some scribes arguing with them. When the whole crowd saw Jesus, they were immediately overcome with awe, and they ran forward to greet him. He asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" Someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak, and whenever it seizes him, it dashes him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they could not do so." He answered them, "You faithless generation, how much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me." and they brought the boy to him. When the spirit saw Jesus, immediately it threw the boy into convulsions, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. It has often cast him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you are able to do anything, have pity on us and help us." Jesus said to him, "If you are able, all things can be done for the one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out, "I believe. Help my unbelief." Jesus' tough question for this week actually has two parts. First, he says to the disciples, "How much longer must I be among you? And then, how much longer must I put up with you?" It's one of those moments in the Gospels when we get to see Jesus' human side. I love those moments. And it's not hard to understand why Jesus was frustrated. It's like when you come home from a long day at work and you've discovered that your dog has somehow got a hold of a full bag of garbage, right? And has strewn it across your entire house. I've had that happen more than once. You still love your dog, right? You still love your dog, but it's probably not out of the question that you're going to say something like, "How much longer must I put up with you?" Maybe not even that nice. Anyone who's ever raised kids has probably experienced the same kind of thing. As I was thinking about that this week, I remembered a video. It was a viral video that went out a couple of years ago of a father videotaping his two very guilty young sons. And so we're just going to watch just this short clip.
Whose idea was this? Did you think this was a good idea? Look at brother's face. Who got the paint out?
That's my favorite part, right there. That is my favorite part. He totally throws his younger brother under the bus. But that video, I think this video really illustrates how frustrating life can sometimes be. 1 minute things are great, maybe even mountaintop great. And the next thing you know, you're in the middle of a mess. And it might not even be a mess of your own making. I'm guessing those boys didn't clean up that mess, right? But you still have to clean it up, even though it's not your mess. I imagine when Jesus came down from Mount Tabor, he could relate to the time Moses came down from Mount Sinai. You remember that story? Came down with the 10 Commandments, only to find his people, the people of Israel, dancing around a golden calf. Right? Very similar stories. I see a lot of parallels there. It was not a shining moment in God's story, but it happened. As I always say, I probably say this once every Sunday, the Bible tells the truth about the world, and it tells the truth about us. That even the best of us can fail. Even the best of us have the ability to get on Jesus' last nerve and make him say, "How much longer must I put up with you?" I'm grateful Mark included this story in his gospel, not just because it tells the truth about the disciples, because there's a lot of stories that do that, but also because it introduces us to another character. And I think Mark is inviting us to compare and contrast here. In the same way, I think that most of us can empathize with a frustrated parent, I think most of us can also empathize with a parent, in this case a father, whose child is in trouble. I think we can relate to that. For pretty much all my life, I've had night terrors, things that just wake me up. I wake up, heart pounding, and when I had little ones at home, those night terrors almost always focused on them. I'd wake up just sure that one of them was in mortal danger. Happened all the time. Once, when my daughter Lauren was a baby, she was sleeping with us. And I woke up like that right? Just sure one of my kids was in trouble. And I remember that she was there, and I reached over and I felt her, and she was laying there without a blanket on, and her skin was cold to the touch. Scared me to death. I was just sure I'd suffocated her or something else had happened terrible in the night. So I immediately grabbed her in the dark. I grabbed her by the leg, sat up, spun her around, was kind of shaking her, and about that time her mom turned on the light. Needless to say, Lauren was not very happy about being woken up like that. I was lucky that night. But like the father that we just read about in that story, I also know what it's like to have a child who is seriously ill and in danger. When my oldest son was about 3 or 4 years old, he was diagnosed with something called ileocholic intussusception. Can't believe I still remember what that was. But and what that is it's when the small bowel telescopes into the large bowel. And it almost only happens in infants. And he wasn't an infant. He was a little kid at this point. When it's diagnosed quickly, it can be easily reversed. I won't go into how that's done. It's kind of funny, but I'm not going to go into how that's reversed. But if it's not caught, it can be deadly. So we were blessed to have a very smart pediatrician who, in Dayton, Ohio, where we lived at the time, who figured it out, and Ryan got the treatment that he needed, and he was fine. So jump ahead about 5 years. We were living in a small rural community, and our second son, Joel, began having identical symptoms at right about the same age. So you can imagine where our minds went, right? So we took him to the small county hospital in the town where we lived, and we told them what we thought it was, and they assured us that it couldn't be that because ileocholic intussusception doesn't happen to toddlers. It only happens to babies. Well, you can imagine our reaction. I was not going to, knowing what could happen, right? Knowing what could happen. I wasn't going to take no for an answer. Now, I don't remember all of the details, but I'm pretty sure we made a scene. I don't think we were spilling God on anybody that day. Eventually, they did do the necessary test, but not because they wanted to, right? But because we made enough noise. And they discovered we were right. And he was fine, thank God. With my boy in danger, I would have done anything to get him the help he needed, even if it meant making a scene. And that's how I imagine the father in our story felt, too. He heard Jesus was a healer. I mean, word of Jesus' miraculous healings had gotten out. A lot of people were coming to him. He believed Jesus could help his son. And when the disciples, Jesus' disciples, failed to do that, he still didn't give up, right? In fact, I think he made enough of a scene that it began to attract attention. And the attention, particularly of those scribes, who I'm sure thought that they probably knew something about healing, maybe knew a thing or two about exorcising demons. And then what happens next is just about exactly what you'd expect from a bunch of men. They began to argue. It became, I think, some kind of an intellectual question that they had to solve. They began to argue, probably religious stuff. Who knows what they were arguing about at this point. But I'm also guessing that the father and his son were the last thing on their minds at that point. So it's no wonder Jesus was annoyed when he came down and found that mess. Fortunately, neither the disciples nor the scribes got the last word in that day. As anyone who's ever had a desperately sick child might guess, you know how far you'd be willing to go. It was the father. That honor went to the father who cried out, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. What we see in him is not only a father's love and desperation, but also a beautiful example of faith in action. This is what real faith looks like. It's not about building a chapel on a mountaintop and never coming back down into the real world. It's not about that. Likewise, it's not some kind of intellectual exercise. It's not something you argue about. When I began working on my sermon last week, I jotted down a quick thought. And when I went back and looked at it again, I realized it was actually a fairly good summary of my message for today. This is what I wrote. Ministry in the real world is not white tower, I think I meant ivory tower intellectualism. It's not mountaintop ecstasy. It's real world messiness that can make even Jesus lose his patience. The thing is, as long as we're in this life, things are going to get messy. There's no getting out of that. And that's why the humility of that desperate father is such a good example for us. He said, I believe, help my unbelief. I'm weak, but that same weakness can lead me to God's strength. That's how it works. I'm limited, but those same limitations can lead me to God's sufficiency, His completeness, His wholeness. I might not be able to handle things on my own, but as Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. As long as we live in this world, there is going to be uncertainty and even doubt. That's not the opposite of faith or belief. It's there. It's always going to be there. As it says in Hebrews, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith isn't about certainty. It's about believing and trusting in God, even when it might be easier or more reasonable to just give up. It's about, and I think this is really important, it's about not letting unbelief run the show, run your life, because it wants to. Same thing could be said about a lot of other things, true. Same thing could be said about sadness. It's normal to be blue every now and then. It's normal to be mad every now and then. Just don't move in. Don't live there. In the same way, Jesus wouldn't let Peter, James, and John stay up on that mountaintop. Don't get stuck in the valley of despair either. Be humble enough to recognize your need and ask for help. Sometimes I think it takes something big, like a sick kid, to help us figure that out. It's been said that there are no atheists in foxholes, right? When the combat is all around you, that's when you realize, man, I do need God. I need to trust in something bigger than myself. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. But I do believe there are times in our lives, especially when our power is limited and our need is great, when we are open to believing and trusting in ways we never have before. So whether you're in a foxhole right now or confidently strolling through life without a care in the world, may today's tough question for you be both a warning but also an encouragement. The warning is this: don't be the one to step on Jesus' last nerve. Don't be the one to make him ask, how much longer must I put up with you? Instead, be the one who says, Lord, I don't always get it right, and I can't do this without you. I do believe. Help thou my unbelief. Amen.